So here's some interesting news. Baker, an evangelical Christian publisher, is just this month publishing this new book, Christ-like Acceptance Across Deep Divides, and it is edited by a non-affirming scholar, meaning not affirming gay marriage, gay relationships, named Ronald Pierce, and an affirming scholar named Karen Keene. And so this evangelical publisher is publishing this book where the authors or the editors and authors are proposing recognizing differences over same-sex relationships as disputable matters within Christianity, that Christians can agree to disagree on these issues. Ethically, it's like the difference between Christians on just war versus pacifism, that you can each agree that it's an important issue and you're both Christians and you both disagree and you can still fellowship together. It's not an issue to divide over. Uh, that shows the fact that it is Baker that is publishing this rather than Erdman's or Whippenstock or some other more mainline publisher is pretty significant because it shows that evangelicalism is shifting. And I know conservative evangelicals hate to hear this or acknowledge it, but it's the reality. This is also a quick opportunity for me to give you a brief update. I'm really excited about my book on this topic, arguing for the compatibility of evangelicalism and being gay affirming. And I hope that that's going to be out in the fall. The way that things are going, it'll probably be out in the fall. And I'm excited to say that the book's argument, I believe, is pretty unique. I haven't seen the argument I'm making done by anybody else. So what I'm here to talk about today, however, is not this book, but Sean McDowell and a colleague of his named Scott, they did a review of this book on Sean McDowell's YouTube channel. And I'm going to be reviewing that in a few installments now. And the first one we're going to look at today, they talk about, Sean McDowell talks about polygamy. And so I want to take a look at that and then explain why he fails in this. First of all, why is polygamy a relevant conversation at all? Well, the Bible clearly represents God's people having polygamous relationships. So then the question is this, today, of course, we don't accept polygamy as a permissible matrimonial arrangement. So then the issue is this, in the Bible, does God affirm polygamous relationships? And if there's evidence that God does affirm polygamous relationships, then you have at least one of two options. The first option is that, well, let's say three options. The first option is that we ought to accept polygamous relationships today. And there's nobody really arguing that, except in the cases like, let's say, a missionary overseas dealing with certain situations in a polygamous culture. But that's actually another interesting question we could talk about. But really, there's two other options. So one option is to say that polygamous relationships are imperfect, but under certain conditions, God accommodates to them and affirms them. So they're like these authors are arguing in this book, they're not an issue that you would divide over. They're a disputable matter because God would allow certain of his disciples to have polygamous relationships. So that's significant. That's an interesting point. The second option is even more radical. It's to say that polygamous relationships are always wrong, but the Bible does depict God as affirming them, which means the Bible sometimes falsely presents God as affirming things God did not affirm. That would be a more radical take. Either way, what McDowell can't do or what he doesn't want to do is to say that the Bible includes content in which God is presented as affirming polygamous relationships, because then that puts the pinchers on him either to have to say, well, then God could maybe affirm other relationships that are not one man and one woman, or he would have to say maybe we should accept polygamous relationships. It's like a dilemma for him. So let's watch McDowell try to downplay polygamous relationships in the Bible in the clip, and then I'm going to offer some thoughts on the other side. Okay, so in this section, we're going to play about a minute. McDowell's going to begin by saying, "Oh, this one of the authors, he made this comment about the Bible and polygamy in the Bible, and the McDowell is going to respond.
It says, for example, polygamy and concubinage are presented as acceptable behavior in the Old Testament. Now, I don't want to give
There's a
too long
lot
on
of
this,
discussion on that.
but I would give huge pause.
Correct.
If by permission,
Sorry, but I love how he says, okay, so he says that Bible affirms polygamy in the Old Testament, and then both of them right away say, well, we don't want to talk about this too long. It's just not too long. Okay.
it means God used individuals like David and Solomon and Jacob who are polygamous. Yes. Does that mean God affirms that as morally okay? I would say no. Now, in some ways, I wish the Bible was more explicit against polygamy, but the Old Testament teaches primarily narratively. And from Genesis 4, the first polygamist, who's a murderer and a despicable character, to the life of David, the life of Jacob, the life of Solomon, we see worked out rejecting God's creative norm, which is teaching that this isn't okay.
Yeah, no editorial comments are needed.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually very common among evangelicals to say, well, actually, the Bible does condemn polygamy clearly in the Old Testament, but it does it narratively. And of course, Sean McDowell says the Bible, the Old Testament, the way it teaches about moral issues is narratively. No, it teaches through the Torah. First, well, and particularly Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, right? That's where you get the law being laid out, Numbers. And I mean that's where the Bible is primarily teaching in the Old Testament on ethical issues. So that's the first thing. The issue is when you talk about teaching narratively, there's a really high risk there of subjectivity on the part of the reader projecting into a narrative what they want to see. Because of course the narrative is typically somewhat ambiguous. There's a degree of ambiguity in a narrative that is not in a law teaching, right, where it just says do not do X. It's not there in the narrative. So this right there is a big problem. Sean McDowell wants to claim the Bible is clear on condemning polygamous relationships from the beginning, in fact. But I'm just going to give you some examples to show how that is emphatically not the case. So we can begin with Genesis 30, and this is where we begin to read about the children that are conceived and will be born who will form the 12 tribes of Israel. Absolutely pivotal here. So Leah and Rachel are two sisters. They've both been married off to the same man, um, Jacob, and no condemnation here from God about this. And then they're both fighting to have more children than the other. So Rachel is not bearing children, so she says to Jacob, "Give me a child or I die." He gets angry. And then she says, verse 3, well, here's my servant, have sex with her. So he has sex with her servant, and then he also has sex with Leah's servant, his other wife, and has sex with his wives, eventually produces 12 children. So he has sex with four women, only two of whom are even his wives. And not only is there no clear condemnation here from God on this behavior, this sexual free-for-all, but he is blessed with the 12 tribes that form the very people of Israel. In Second Samuel, this is when Nathan is condemning David, right? Where, with respect to Bathsheba stealing Uriah's wife, Nathan says to him, condemning him, you are that man. And then he says of God, I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. So God actively gave multiple wives to King David. Think about that. Does that sound like God is condemning polygamy when he actively gives David multiple wives? Of course, we all know, and I talked about this a while ago in my YouTube channel. David, even though he had hundreds of wives and concubines. He ended up his days snuggling in bed with a nubile young woman named Abishag, and because she needed to keep him warm, because the blankets weren't enough. He needed a pretty young thing to climb into bed with him when he's an 85-year-old. No condemnation from God on that. Deuteronomy 21. So now we actually come to the Torah and the teaching, and it gives explicit directions for a man having two wives. If a man has two wives and he loves one but not the other, and both bear him sons, blah, 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 blah. So this is extraordinary. Throughout Deuteronomy, throughout Leviticus, throughout Exodus, God is condemning things that are immoral. There's no condemnation here of polygamy. Rather, there are directions of how to act in a polygamous relationship, just like how you would act in a monogamous relationship. This is really, really interesting. So, Ezekiel tells a parable of God with his relationship with Israel and Judah. And he depicts God in this passage in Ezekiel 23 as a man who has two wives. Uh, that's extraordinary. And this in the way that evangelicals interpret the prophets, this is actually God speaking directly through Ezekiel to the people. God actively saying, I am a polygamist, and these are my two wives. And then he goes on and makes points about their unfaithfulness. But Yahweh is not indicted by being the man in that polygamous relationship. Only the people who are unfaithful, the two women, are indicted morally in that example, in that illustration. So there's zero condemnation here of polygamy. And Sean McDowell and his fellow uh, guy Scott, I don't know his last name. They're like so clear that, oh, the Bible clearly condemns polygamy because all these people had really difficult times. When you're talking about the Bible over and over again in the Old Testament affirms polygamy. So then again, you have to consider, does this mean that God adapts to and does not treat as a disputable or as an issue to divide over suboptimal non-heterosexual monogamous relationships? And if he's allowed for polygamy like that, then in principle, what other possibilities does he allow for? Could it be then that a monogamous same-sex relationship is something God could accommodate to? And the second point is does and well, actually, let me deal with an objection to that first point. It says, well, if you accomplish something there, you accomplish too much because this creates a slippery slope in which, well, then can you have polygamous relationships now? And could you have polyamorous relationships? It kind of opens up the door. I mean, if Jacob can be sleeping with his two wives and their two servants, sounds kind of like polyamory. I mean, I get that there's a point there that you ultimately want to get a child out of it, but nobody's saying Jacob didn't have an orgasm. Pardon me for saying the obvious here. So it does open up, in terms of a slippery slope, the possibility of all of these relationships that most people, certainly I would want to condemn. That's why I would well, that's not why, but that's certainly one factor into why I am inclined to think the second option in thinking about polygamy is the better one. In other words, the Bible depicts a lot of content, not of what God has commanded and affirmed, but of what human beings projected onto God as having commanded and affirmed. It's a record of the human story of thinking about God. Um, Now, this changes certainly with Jesus. Jesus, I believe, he is the one who is presented as God to us. He is the incarnate God the Son, and he tells us he is the heuristic, the guide, the light, the way to read the Bible, and we should follow him. But that's different from when we come to aspects of other portions of Scripture. So, in my view, just like I've argued on, for example, in Jesus Loves Canaanites, that there are false claims about what God has commanded in terms of the eradication of civilian populations, genocide, slaughtering women, children, and infants in God's name. I don't think God ever commanded such a thing. So I don't think God ever commanded or affirmed or provided uh, um, an affirmation of polygamy. God certainly may have worked with people who were in polygamous relationships. God did accommodate to them, but it doesn't follow that God, in fact, affirmed it. But John McDowell doesn't have that same option because he has a very different way of approaching the Bible, right? That this is all God's perfect record of how to live. And when he does that, well, then he comes to the polygamy passages in the Bible and he can't be honest about them. He can't recognize that the Old Testament clearly, the Hebrew Bible clearly affirms polygamy in multiple places. And so it leads him to engage in this fanciful eisegetical reading where he projects a condemnation of polygamy onto the narrative passages because of the alleged failings of polygamists. It's a completely subjective, arbitrary, self-serving reading, but it manages to kind of, for him in his mind, protect his reading of the Bible from the objectionable moral content with respect to polygamous relationships. All of this, anyway, it doesn't tell us how to think about same-sex relationships, but it does say that simply citing a Bible verse does not settle the question or end the conversation.